uninhabitable by people depending upon agriculture for their subsistence, Western explorer Josiah Gregg. A barren and desolate waste which serves as a natural barrier between civilized man and the savage, Western explorer Randolph Marcy. It was if day had turned to night, the dust cloud billowed black and as high as a man could see, blotting out the sun and bringing darkness all around. Oh, if only it would rain. A Dust Bowl farmer. No one accuses A.L. Black of being short of foresight. John Erickson, in the November 1977 edition of Cattleman magazine. While many were giving up on rural America, A.L. Black was giving his best to find a better way because he knew that rural America must be saved. Ron Davenport, president of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. Remembering his childhood days in the drought of the 1930s, A.L. Black became a visionary for what water would mean to Texas. Water and soil conservation have been hallmarks of his life's work, and he's done as much as any man to provide answers to water problems and improve the quality of life for people in agriculture. Dolph Briscoe, Jr., former governor of Texas. The last fight will be at the water hole. A.L. Black. Those dark days of the 1930s left an indelible impression on a young man growing up on a farm near Clovis, New Mexico. It must have been tempting during the worst of the Depression for his family to join the thousands of others who packed up and went west in search of greener pastures. But A.L. Black comes from tough stock, and his parents were determined to make a life on their homestead in eastern New Mexico. So they stayed and impressed upon their son that not only was agriculture a good way of life, but that in his hands and in his mind and in his spirit, he held the power to make it better. It was a lesson he would never forget and a commitment that not even the rolling dust clouds of the Depression could erase. By the time he was 12 or 14, he was helping his dad buy cattle to ship to market in Kansas City and Fort Worth. His job was to drive the cattle on horseback to railheads in Clovis or Tucumcari, where they would be gathered and shipped, a task that took from 2 to 5 days. The Depression was over when he graduated from high school in 1938 and married Clyde, his high school sweetheart, in 1939. Right after they were married, he and Clyde started a sheep ranch near Ima, New Mexico. They stayed until 1944 when they sold out for a profit and bought a half section of land near the now non-existent town of Hub, Texas in Palmer County. Later, they bought another section and settled down to farming and ranching in the Texas Panhandle, eventually moving to Friona, where they've lived ever since. But settling down was never one of A.L. Black's strong points. I like to see things happen, he says, and he quickly set about doing exactly that. One of the first things he did on his new farm was to drill a well, new technology in a land that relied on scant rainfall to raise crops. To Black, the gushing water was more precious than oil because he knew that with it, his children would never go through another dust bowl. But as more and more High Plains farmers tapped the Ogallala Aquifer, A.L. began to notice something. The water table seemed to get lower while water puddled at the end of the rows to be sucked up by the relentless Texas sun. So in typical A.L. Black fashion, he set out to see things happen. In 1949, he helped establish the Palmer County Soil and Water Conservation District and served as a director for 32 years. He worked tirelessly to educate other farmers about soil and water conservation, and by the 1960s, he was getting noticed for his strong convictions and natural leadership. In 1967, he was elected president of the Association of Texas Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and in 1970 was appointed a director of the National Association of Soil Conservation Districts. Many would have been content with that, but A.L., still remembering the dark days of the Depression, was a man with a mission, and he made water and soil conservation his second job. In so doing, he became a fixture in many circles of government. Doc Briscoe, former governor of Texas, developed a lifelong friendship with A.L. Black as a result.
A.L. Black is one of those few people who have truly made a real difference in the lives of others because of his life of dedicated service to his fellow man. He always set his goals not just high, but what practically everyone else thought was beyond his reach, or that of anyone else, and really beyond the realm perhaps of reality or possibility. That has never turned out to be the case for A.L. Black. He set out many years ago to make the people of our state more aware of the importance of conservation and proper utilization of our greatest natural resource, water. This he has accomplished. He also set out to build an agricultural and agribusiness empire based upon the conservation and proper utilization of the limited water supply of West Texas. This he has done. When I had the opportunity and responsibility to appoint someone to the Water Development Board in 1974, I knew that there was no one who would bring greater dedication, experience, and effectiveness to that job than A.L. Black. It was later, in 1976, that it was my privilege to appoint him as chairman and to appoint him to the Western States Water Council in 1978. Among his many accomplishments during those years of service to our state was the merging of the three boards dealing with water into one united and more effective state agency. He provided the unquestioned integrity, the driving force of dynamic determination, along with good common West Texas horse sense, to establish a water conservation policy for the state of Texas. We shall forever be indebted to him for his dedicated service to our state and to his fellow man. Because of his service, he has made a difference here in West Texas and throughout our state, a difference that will make Texas a better state, a better place in which to live, and a better place in which to raise our children in the years ahead. Of A.L. Black, it can truly be said, well done. You have made this world a better place because you have been here.
In addition to serving in a public capacity, A.L. Black also worked privately to ensure the High Plains water resource wouldn't dry up. In 1969, he became director, and in 1973 served as president of Water Incorporated, a Lubbock-based organization established to promote the importation of water to the Texas High Plains. Evidence of A.L.'s early work in water conservation and education are still apparent. Dr. Herb Grubb, now with HDR Engineering in Austin, worked with A.L. for the many years they were both at the Texas Water Development Board.
Vision, imagination, dedication. These are words that describe A.L. Black. While he was on the Texas Water Development Board, he worked tirelessly to develop a water plan for Texas that would meet all of the needs of the state. Water for people in cities, water for industry, water for agriculture. He did extra effort for the Great Plains. He helped to organize the Ogallala Six-State High Plains Study Council involving Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. Through the efforts of this study, he chaired the council, and for the study of 1978 to 1982, many of the water conservation technologies that were developed in the Texas High Plains were communicated to and transferred to the other 5 members of the council. The work of that study, led by A.L., will probably extend the life of the Ogallala Aquifer for several decades in most states, and maybe as much as a century in some places. A.L. knows and appreciates the value of water and has dedicated much of his life to its conservation.
Many people recognize the importance of A.L.'s work in water conservation. Numerous articles were written and many awards were given. Of those awards, one of the most significant was a 1982 honor from the Army Corps of Engineers for outstanding civilian service to the United States Army. From the turn row to the highest levels of the Pentagon, people were taking notice of A.L. Black. While A.L. was campaigning daily to conserve water, he was also building a business in agriculture with an economic impact on the Panhandle that is nothing short of amazing. With irrigation, Panhandle agriculture took off like a prairie fire, and the area's grain and cattle producers enjoyed bountiful harvest. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, a few far-sighted folks realized that the Panhandle had the basics of a major industry, cattle feeding. That was when A.L. really began to get active in business. In the early 1960s, a group of Freona farmers began to discuss building a feed yard. By 1962, 10 area farmers, including A.L., decided to build a feed yard, and the group elected A.L. chairman. The group pooled their capital and built Freona Feed Yard, which became the nucleus of Freona Industries. And from there, as they say, the rest was history. Let's listen as Texas Cattle Feeders Association President Ron Davenport, who spent much of his career with Freona Industries, tells the story.
After Freona Feed Yard was up and running, A.L. and the other investors realized that while they had ample supply of grain, there was no local supply of the additional supplements needed to balance a feed yard ration. Their supplement was being shipped out of Colorado. So they decided to build a supplement mill, which they called Hi-Pro, and they hired me to run the plant. While the plant was being built, they put me in a pickup selling vet supplies. That worked so well that we decided to open a vet supply store along with the supplement plant. So without really planning for it, we found ourselves in the vet supply business too. We knew that Hi-Pro could produce more commercial feed than we could use at Freona Feed Yard, which had a 7,000 head capacity at that time. A.L. and the rest of the owners got concerned that they couldn't sell the additional supplement, so they decided to build another feed yard. The idea was that we would produce the feed for the new feed mill in the Hi-Pro plant, therefore being able to justify the expense. So we built Payco Feed Yard with a 35,000 head capacity. Before we got the Payco yard completed, the Hi-Pro mill was finished and we had more supplement business than we could handle. So we were back in the feed mill construction business again, building another feed mill at Payco. Within a period of a few short years, we had grown from a single small feed yard to a commercial agribusiness company with 2 feed yards, a vet supply business, and a commercial feed mill.
Then the early 70s came along and brought what many in cattle feeding call simply the wreck. But A.L. and the fledgling Freona Industries survived because they had established a strong reputation among banks and had the lines of credit they needed to carry them through the disaster. This reputation was based largely on the influence of one man, A.L. Black. In fact, A.L., who is ever the optimist, saw growth potential from the wreck of the early 70s. Feed yards were for sale cheap, and Freona Industries purchased a third. Their vet supply business expanded to 7 stores, and their total employment was nearly 300 people. Throughout this period, A.L. Black purchased many thousands of cattle on a handshake alone. For A.L. Black, the cattleman's motto that a deal's a deal and a man's only as good as his word were his daily business ethic. Many of the cattle A.L. bought came from longtime friend and cattle trader Eugene B. Swertner, owner of Capital Land and Livestock at Swertner.
Oh, never was a question. We wouldn't take care of a deal. Didn't make any difference how bad it got. He never did see the cattle. He'd buy them over the telephone. Never did see any cattle until he got there. There's not many people you can call and sell 18 to 23 or 4,000 cattle over the telephone, never see them. They knew the cattle was going to be like I told them. And I knew his word was good, so that's all it took.
And you never worried about him backing out of a deal?
Oh, it never come to my mind. Wasn't any such thing as backing out. When they all told you something, it was that way. We never did have a contract. We just write it down on a piece of paper.
Even though Eugene knew that A.L. was a man of his word, He learned just how far A.L. would go when a packing plant in Clovis, New Mexico went broke, leaving Friona Industry holding the bag for several hundred head of Eugene's cattle.
So I didn't know they wasn't going broke. When I started getting the cattle from Friona and checked for the cattle from Friona Industries and placed a packing house. And people told me this packing house went broke up there. So I called A.L. I said, "You lose any money on this deal?" He said, "The Friona Industries losing money. They're paying for these cattle. We sold them and we stand by them." A lot of places you wouldn't got the money for them those days. Well, they believe in him. Everybody's ever done business with, they believe in him. Because when he tell you something, it's that way.
Business growth continued in the 1970s with the feed yards and commercial feed business. Friona Industries was using about 2 million pounds of grain a day, not counting the commercial feed they were shipping. So the company bought a trucking business. And with the quantity of grain they were handling, they realized a need for their own grain facilities, so they purchased black grain. Then, in an effort to assist their customers who needed additional credit, Friona Industries established a finance organization known as Friona Ag Credit. A.L. and his partners capitalized it for $2 million to start with and acquired additional financing on the open market, and they still weren't through growing. Ron Davenport explains.
We had an opportunity to diversify even more. We acquired Village Meats, a processing plant that supplied hamburger to the Wendy's restaurants. At our peak, we were supplying Wendy's with more than 1 million pounds of hamburger a week. Also during this time, we acquired Porch Brothers in Hereford. The two brothers who owned the company built and maintained our feed mills. When they retired, we acquired their company, which allowed us to bring our own mill maintenance in-house, as well as diversify by offering construction and maintenance services to others.
A.L. continued as chairman of the board until he retired in 1982. When he retired, Friona Industries had about 560 employees and 766 shareholders. Throughout his professional career, A.L. Black has taken an active interest in politics. So when the grandson of some very close friends decided to run for public office, A.L. encouraged him strongly. That young politician heeded A.L.'s advice and embarked on a highly successful political career, capped with his election 3 years ago as Speaker of the House of the Texas Legislature, the Honorable Pete Laney, Democrat from Hale Center.
I was just a kid when I first met A.L. Black. It was probably in my grandfather's living room, and they were probably talking about soil conservation. One of my first lessons in civics came from A.L. Black. It wasn't anything that he ever said to me, but rather his example that impressed me. A.L.'s attitude on getting involved in the affairs of your state and nation wasn't that it was a privilege, but rather your responsibility to take an active role in your government. My image of A.L. has changed very little over the course of our friendship. He embodies all the characteristics of a true statesman, whether he was walking in the halls of the state capitol, in the halls of Congress, in a feed yard alley, or a turn row in a corn patch. His low-key, deliberate, and determined way has remained constant over the years. His advice and counsel goes without question. A.L. continues to represent the characteristics that made this state great.
With the rapidly growing cattle feeding industry, it became apparent that Panhandle feed yards needed packing plants. Again, it was A.L. Black, this time wearing his Chamber of Commerce hat, who rose to the challenge. He was the driving force in securing a beef packing plant in Friona in 1967, the first major packing facility on the High Plains. Owned by Missouri Beef Packers, now Excel Corporation, the plant started operation in 1968 with a capacity to slaughter 1,500 head a day. The plant's initial employment was 250 people, and it added more than $1 million in payroll to the Friona area. Today, the plant handles 3,600 head per day, employs 1,600 people, and has an annual payroll in excess of $25 million. All throughout the time A.L. was building Freona Industries, he was also engaged in his own farm and ranch. From the initial 1.5 sections he bought, which he still owns, by the way, he's been continuously engaged in ranching, farming, and livestock production. Currently, A.L. farms 8,000 acres of wheat and milo and runs 2,000 yearlings, which are eventually placed in feed yards. His son, Danny, is actively involved in the day-to-day operation of the farm.
But since I've been around and watching A.L. and his farming practices, his number one issue was to conserve the land and water that we farm. Not only to have a good year this year to make it better for next year. Even though we started with small things, right now we're farming a lot of land. We have some of the largest equipment that Caterpillar makes as far as a tractor, a 65-foot plow. And all of his ideals go from small to large. I've been privileged to work with A.L. and seeing these ideals come to reality. Never worrying about so much the outcome is to make a better world, to feed the hungry, and to serve our land as it needs to be. As far as I know, A.L. had some of the first irrigation in our area, updated years later to sprinkler systems. We've terraced land, we've leveled land, we've floated land to make that land produce the best it could. And as A.L. has served on the water board and soil conservation, trying to learn how to do the best job that he could do in the farming industry.
A.L., with his keen political sense, could tell that the growing cattle feeding industry needed its own voice, and he was a founding member of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association. A.L. has served twice on the TCFA Board of Directors, once in the 1970s and again in the 90s, and on the association's executive committee, as well as contributing many hours to the success of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association arbitration program and political action committee. He has represented TCFA on the board at the National Cattlemen's Association, but perhaps his greatest contribution to the Texas Cattle Feeders Association came indirectly. When A.L. built Freona Feed Yard, he hired a dynamic young man from Colorado named Jack Carruthers to manage the operation. Carruthers, with A.L.'s blessing and encouragement, was one of the 10 original founding members of the Texas Cattle Feeders Association and became the association's first president. Now, nearly 30 years later, another young man that Freona Industries hired is following in the same footsteps. Ron Davenport, TCFA's current president, is the latest legacy that A.L. Black has given the industry that has given so much to A.L. Black. Throughout it all, building Freona Industries and getting a new association off the ground, A.L. was the man behind the scenes, offering advice, support, and encouragement. He didn't mind if others got the recognition and glory. In fact, he preferred it that way. He was content to work behind the scenes, doing whatever it took to make things happen up front. You'd think that campaigning nonstop for water conservation, building one of the nation's largest and most diversified agricultural enterprises, and farming full-time would keep anybody busy. But A.L. was always willing to give himself to the community. Robert Neelley, Freona State Bank, is one of the community leaders who has seen A.L. in action.
I have known and worked with A.L. Black for over 30 years in numerous community and business activities in Freona. If you were to follow A.L. around, you might see him in any number of roles. He might be serving barbecue at a 4th of July celebration in Freona, or working cattle, or working on a plow at his farm, or meeting with the governor, or giving testimony in Washington, chairing a church committee meeting, or attending a bank board meeting. He has served in so many different roles in our community over the years that he is almost taken for granted in leadership positions. most of our local residents really have no idea how much time and effort A.L. has invested in their behalf. A.L. Black has held many offices and received recognition in so many areas that listing them all would seem repetitive. However, I feel he should receive some special recognition for a few things. For instance, he is largely responsible for the location of Missouri Beef Packers, which is now XL Corporation, packing plant in our area, and for his work with the soil and water resources in the area. His contributions to water management through his role as president of Water Incorporated and as chairman of the Texas Water Development Board has been substantial. He also spends a great deal of time working in his church and serves on the board of the Hardin Simmons Board of Trustees. He's also served as chairman of the board of Freeland State Bank since 1968. He's the recipient of the Man of the Year Award by both the Amarillo Area Chamber and the Freona Chamber of Commerce. A.L. can be characterized easily in 3 words: hard work and integrity. I quickly learned not to call him after 10 p.m. or before 4 a.m. Otherwise, he is always available to lend a hand.
A.L. may have retired as chairman of Freona Industries in 1982, but retirement was the last thing on his mind. Instead of taking his Freona Industries stock in cash and slowing down, A.L. acquired Porsche Brothers Freona Steel Fabrication business in Hereford and has served as president of the company ever since. Even today, at the age of 77, A.L. still divides his days between Porsche Brothers and his extensive farming and livestock operation. And finally, A.L. Black is a family man, a person who realizes the importance of strong roots and family ties. One of his passions throughout life was good horses, and ever since he was a boy, he's been noted for his horsemanship, and much of his life could be marked by the horses he rode. Some men are known by the cars they drive, but A.L. is recognized for the horses he rode, all superior in ability and performance. His daughter, Kitty Black Gallman, talks about her dad's love affair with his horses.
Their names could be chapter titles in a book telling how my dad learned about cattle and the land and how precious water is. Trixie, Champion, Smoky, Jick, Snip, Sugar, and Mister. Names of horses woven into the tapestry of my dad's life. They were the indispensable tools of his trade. Tough, smart, tireless, yet he demanded no more from them than he did from himself. Saddle up before daylight, make a circle, check the stock tanks, count the cattle, doctor the sick ones, gather cattle, move cattle, receive cattle, deliver cattle, shape cattle. The pattern was first set in 1927 when a 9-year-old kid began riding a pony he called Trixie, Chapter 1. For 10 years it was saddle up, ride all day, take care of the cattle, don't stop till you're done, pay attention, and learn all you can. Champion would be Chapter 2. He was a paint Daddy rode during the 40s. Chapter 3, Smoky. Big 1,400-pound black Smoky, thundered through the 50s and 60s, hopped in the pickup, fed like a dog, because Daddy didn't have time to fool with a trailer. Smoky, who could wheel 180 degrees in mid-air without breaking stride, so rough no one but Daddy could stay on him. Smoky, the one who loved to drink Pepsi-Cola from a bottle. Chapter 4, the 60s and 70s. Jick, a blood bay gelding from the Bell Ranch. Jick, quiet, tough, no nonsense, all business, cool-headed, nose low to the ground, smooth as silk. Daddy never had to throw a loop, just opened it once over his head and let it drop as Jick cut the calf into it. Daddy says, Jick knew how to take care of you, even if you had an 1,800-pound bull on the other end of the rope. Chapter 5, the 80s would be shared by 3. First was Snip, a fine sorrel. Then Daddy fell in love with Sugar. She was quick, smart, sparkling with energy, and Sugar loved Daddy too. She even allowed him to teach her tricks so he could show her off to folks. He truly grieved when she died young. Why he chose a horse like Mister to be the last one he rode, I'll never know. Daddy was nearly 70, and Mr. pitched every time a saddle was cinched on him. But he was a smart cow horse who would pay attention to the job that needed to be done, a characteristic all his horses had in common. For over 65 years, the pages of Daddy's life were filled with stories his horses helped him write. Finally, after having surgery on his back 3 times, Daddy's doctors convinced him he had to hang up his spurs and never ride again. A sad fate for someone who says, "I've always had a love for horses."
A.L. has a quote he's fond of saying. After more than 50 years of fighting for sound water and soil conservation efforts, he refers to the old Grade B Westerns, where there was always a fight around the water hole. For the high plains, he says the last fight will also be at the water hole, because without this precious resource, high plains agriculture would wither and die. But because of A.L.'s untiring efforts, that fight, if it comes at all, will be a long time off. Water warrior, highly successful businessman, devoted civic leader, all these words describe A.L. Black. But if the measure of a person's success is not in what they built, but in how long it stands after they're gone, then A.L. Black stands mighty tall. Because when you see cool, clear water running down a furrow on a panhandle farm, you can thank Mr. Water, A.L. Black.